We're going to look at a number of landscapes today to help understand how they're constructed and how that leads the viewer's eye around a painting. We're going to look at some historical landscapes and also by some people who are currently painting and alive. This first landscape that you see in front of you is by Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, a French painter. It's called The Bridge at Narni and is one of the most famous landscape paintings in the world. When we look at it, we can see some conventions of the way landscapes are put together. Traditionally, landscapes have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. So here in the foreground, we could see the mountains and the water up front, the trail coming in, this hillside over here. The middle ground has all this architectural structure right here, which are the ruins of an ancient Roman aqueduct. And then in the background, you see the far off mountains in the distance, as well as those clouds right above the horizon line. I want you to notice something with those distant mountains. The painter here is using atmospheric perspective to make those mountains look as though they are sitting far back in space. When you're working with perceptual painting, one of the things you want to do is basically make the painting a box of light and air. You want the depth to be believable. You want to be able to take the space and pull it open as if you were pulling open an accordion. Set the distance far back into the background. Have the middle ground be full of interesting information. And then usually try to simplify the foreground a little bit so it isn't quite as detailed as the middle ground. And that will allow the viewer's eyes to be a bit like Superman zooming right into that landscape, right over the foreground, and exploring the wonderful detail in the middle ground. So look at those hills in the background again, and let's talk about what atmospheric perspective is. Atmospheric perspective is the idea that as things get further and further away from you, they have more sky between themselves and you, the painter, you, the viewer. In this case, the sky is kind of this dusty light blue color. And so those mountains, even though we understand that they're covered with vegetation, that really they're some version of green if we think of the local color, as they go back in space, they get more and more of the sky color in front of them. So if you actually look at them, they're not that far in value or in hue from the actual sky itself. We tend to think of the sky as being above us, but one of the most important things I learned when painting the landscape is actually the sky is between us. But if you and I are standing close together, then we're not going to see enough sky to really make a difference. However, if you are standing quite a bit further away, then the colors of your body, your clothing will appear less saturated. They're going to be more purple. And then if you are a mountain far off at the distant horizon, then imagine how much sky there actually is between you and me, and how much of that sky color with its blues and purples is going to affect our perception. Another thing that is a very common convention in landscape painting is to give the viewer a way to actually enter into the space of the painting. And a lot of times that's done by using diagonals in some way in the foreground. There are a number of ways in which it is done here. For example, if you look at this little V shape formed right here, you could enter into the painting like this, or you can enter into the painting like this. Also, you can follow the river and enter in this way. We tend to think of water as being blue, but really it's only a little bit blue where it's reflecting the sky over here, but it's this muddy kind of earthy yellow tone right here. All these Italian earth colors at use. Also, we've got this path over to the right, and it's leading our eyes also from the foreground into the middle ground. I want you to notice the way Corot paints the trees. He's not attempting to paint every single individual little leaf, twig, or branch. Instead, he's simplifying them. He's seeing them as masses, but he's being very specific about the large shape of those masses and their relationship to each other and to the color spots around them. You always want to think of the relationship of a color spot to its neighbor and the relationship of a color spot to the entirety of the composition. Micro relationships and macro relationships. Look at this gorgeous painting by Inness. It really captures the feel of an East Coast evening. One of the things that's really important as a painter is to identify what part of the painting is in the shadow world and what part of the painting is in the light world. With young painters, this often gets a little murky and confused. But as we look at all of these landscapes, I want you to look and ask yourself, where is the shadow? Where is the light? Does the light world feel unified? Does the shadow world feel unified? Remember that harmony and balance and a beautiful, strong, underlying abstract relationship is what's going to make or break your painting. Otherwise, a painting of any tree would be the same as a painting of any other tree. What takes a painting of a couple of trees and elevates it to the level of visual poetry? It's this abstract, underlying pattern of lights and darks. It's this hierarchy of edges that controls where the viewer's eye moves around the painting. Look at this dark branch with the sharp edge set against that light background of the cloud. Our eye immediately hops there, and that winds up being a focal point. Another focal point is the flash of light on this woman's blouse, encapsulated in this larger, darker spot around her. And then we zoom up to this beautiful tree, and the way the light hits it here against the shadowy side of the tree, and also the darker color, the darker mid-tone of the sky over there. And then there are these wonderful lines, the lines of the trees and the branches that move our eyes around the whole composition to where this wonderful visual flow is achieved. And even here, in that dark foreground, it's activated by having some warmer patches indicative of flowers and just a subtle gradation in the values and the colors that are being used. That's how Inness keeps that foreground from being monotonous and too heavy. There's just enough variation in there to lend interest, but not enough to break up the unity of that large, powerful shadow mass. And then we saw where there were some sharp edges, but look also at where the edges are more medium, and then other places where the edges seem to melt and open up into this atmospheric beauty, where form starts to break down and color explodes. Remember, we're making visual poetry here. It's not a police report. You're not just stating the facts, ma'am. You're interpreting. You're deciding what you want to stress, what you want to diminish, how you want to move the viewer's eye around the entirety of the picture plane, and ultimately what you want the visual story to be. The visual story can be an overt narrative, or it could be more like music, where it's an experience that draws you in and slowly reveals itself to you. It's an enchantment, and you're the one who is weaving together this enchantment. Here is a wonderful Cool in Color painting by Henry Ossawa Tanner. It's called Abraham's Oak. Before, the paintings we were looking at had warmer colors. This has much cooler blues, purples, very low saturation greens. It's evocative of a nighttime scene, and the cool colors give it a sense of calm and even a bit of melancholy. Notice the areas of higher contrast, like this dark and this light right here. These beautiful calligraphic marks of the branches against the sky. The subtle variation within the sky with the way he's putting down the brush strokes. And that variation lends itself to a wonderful feeling of light and air. This painting has such a strong feeling of harmony and unity, and part of that is by the color choices that he's making. By keeping to a more limited silver, blue, slightly green color scheme, an analogous color scheme, because we're talking about colors on the color wheel that are very close together. It's analogous when the colors are neighbors to each other. And when you use an analogous color scheme like this, it automatically creates a great sense of unity. But do you see how around the moon there's a subtle orange glow? This is because he actually had a warm underpainting that he painted on top of. So what that means is before he started the painting, he tinted the canvas with some kind of a warm earthy color. A lot of times painters will use a light layer of burnt umber or burnt sienna for this. And then all the cool colors that he layered on top of it still have some of that warm background radiating through. And it helps give this beautiful shimmer. And whenever you use an analogous color scheme, it really helps if you throw in just a tiny bit of whatever the color is on the opposite side of the color wheel. If you have an overall cool color scheme, see how you can incorporate a little bit of warmth to just add visual interest and just punch that painting up to the next level. Again, in the foreground, we have these two people walking. In the middle ground, we have the structure underneath the tree and the tree itself. And then in the far distance, the background, we have some rolling hills and a sense of farmland. Here is possibly my favorite living painter today, Antonio Lopez Garcia. This is a painting he did of the city he lives in, Madrid. In fact, it's called View of Madrid from Torres Blancas. One of the things that makes Antonio Lopez Garcia a master of painting is the fact that he could put in so much detail into it. Look at all of those different windows. Look at the grids of the windows within those office buildings or apartment buildings. Look at all the detail on the roofs and even the signage over there. And then all those tiny little buildings as we move towards the horizon. He can include all of that information without breaking the overall unity of the abstract design. And now that's really tough to do, because as soon as you start to put in all those details, a lot of times what happens is you start to break apart the large shadow and light masses. So he's very careful about really calibrating his values so that up here in front, when we've got a building like this, you can see there's a lot of contrast between the values of the dark of the windows and the white of the side of the building. And then as we move further back in space, the contrast diminishes, the lights are no longer as bright, the darks are no longer as dark. So we have that sense of moving back in space with atmospheric perspective. And then when we get to that way background over there, look how close the furthest part of the landscape is to the colors in the sky. There's no harsh horizon line here. If it was harsh, it really wouldn't work very well, because one of the big no-nos in landscape composition is placing a horizon line exactly at the halfway point of a painting. And he does that here. And of course, Antonio Lopez Garcia, he knows these rules, but he's able to get away with that because of how melting that horizon line really is, and how much our eye isn't pushed immediately to a harsh line back there, but it slowly melts away into the distance of space, whereas these larger contrast areas catch us and pull us back into the foreground. Here's a painting by Randall Exon. It's called Egrets, after the birds that are flying in the front. Randall Exon uses a great amount of chiaroscuro here. Chiaroscuro means the contrast, the dramatic contrast between light and dark. In Italian, the first part of the word chiaro means light, and scuro means dark. Painters have, for generations, used a strong sense of chiaroscuro to create visual drama in their work. Notice how he places the birds in the foreground as little accent marks to catch our attention. But then we get hooked on just this beautiful light right here and this very hard edge, relatively speaking, as the light part of the barn hits the dark of these clouds over here. There's a very interesting story to Randall Exon that helps put his work in some context. When he was a young kid living on a farm in Kansas, a tornado took down his house. He and his family were hiding in the basement in the tornado shelter while this happened, and he remembers the moment of coming up out of there to just utter and total devastation. Nothing was left. His life was in ruins and shambles about him. And ever since that time, as an artist, as a painter, he's been creating this sort of mythical ideal house in his work. It's a house of memory. It's a house of longing. It's a house that isn't real. It only lives in his work and his imagination. And so that means it's a house that can never be destroyed. It's a house that exists in some level beyond reality, a level steeped in mythology and memory and feelings of homesickness and the longing for permanence and security, and the understanding of how fleeting those qualities are in our actual lives. Here's a beautiful painting by Diana Horowitz. It's a scene of New York, and the title is Bridges from 67. Look at that powerful diagonal that takes us right from the foreground into the middle ground with all this action. Think of how Corot painted his trees and how he didn't show every single leaf and every single branch. And in the same way, Diana Horowitz abstracts the shapes of the buildings. She doesn't attempt to throw everything in, but she understands each of them as an aggregate note. By aggregate note, I mean something that is an overall impact of all the various little details, all the lights and darks that occur within each shape, to understand each large shape as a color spot that has its own identity in terms of hue, intensity, and value, right? That's the anatomy of a color spot: hue, intensity, and value. Intensity is how clear or how muddy the color is, how strong or how muddy it is, like a brick red being low saturation, low intensity, and a fire engine red being high intensity, and value, of course, being light and dark. And hue, of course, being the name of the color. Is it purple? Is it orange? Is it viridian? Is it somewhere in between? Look again at her horizon line over here. Look how soft and melting it is. That's what creates that wonderful sense of air and distance. There is nothing in that background that is high contrast. Those values are squeezed together. There are no loud pops and saturation or anything like that, but a beautiful harmony and the squeezing of values that just allows that to stretch back for miles and miles. Where are our highest areas of value contrast? In the foreground, of course, right here. And that makes that space just open way up. The foreground is up way close to us. The middle ground is full of action, and the background is just way over yonder as far as the eye can see. You control the value relationships, and that is how you create the illusion of space, light, and air. Here's a beautiful domestic painting scene by Erin Raedeke, who is a painter who lives in the DC area. It's titled Backyard Gardens. This painting has higher saturation than Diana Horowitz's cityscape that we were just looking at. Again, we're using some of the same conventions where we have this wonderful diagonal that lets us enter into the space, and this middle ground here where most of the houses are, and even some people that are kind of hidden right in here. And then in terms of focal points, our eye is definitely caught by this dark window in the midst of the light of this wall, possibly the greatest value contrast in the painting, and also this very saturated blue color surrounded by different cools, and then right above it is maybe our second lightest color. So our eyes maybe go here first, and then to this area of contrast, as well as this blue trash can down here. And then further on we travel into where these people are having some kind of an interaction, hiding amongst the houses. Look at how the trees are painted. Not leaves, not branches, but color spots. The same green isn't being used over and over again, but instead it is a wealth of different greens that are always so precisely calibrated, one against the other. And this is our last painting that we're looking at for the moment. This is by Peter Van Dyck, who spends the academic year teaching at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, and then he spends his summers down in Elba, Alabama, where his wife and his wife's family is from. His wife, Carolyn Pyfram, is also a fantastic painter, and I encourage you to look up her work. A lot of times people think of cliches when they think of what is appropriate subject matter for a painting. But really, it could be anything. The story behind a painting can be a few trunks, and then the shadows of those trunks as they extend across a green and earthy lawn. It could be about following these shadows as they take us back to the humble dwellings behind them. It could be about the rhythms of chairs on the lawn, and ultimately branches that lead our eye to a tree in the distance, and then this little car snuggling in its space. Look at the strong diagonal of those shadows, and then the opposite diagonal right here of this line between the muddy, earthy brown and the green of the grass, and how this brings us in from this side. The shadows bring us in from the other side. Everything takes us to this middle ground. And in the background, we just have this wonderful tangle of trees, interspersed beautifully with light blue patches of sky. Look at the areas with the sharper edges and the larger value relationships. And then look at areas that have more medium edges. And then look at areas where form starts to disintegrate and edges start to melt away. A strong hierarchy of edge will help your painting be successful, just like a strong hierarchy of color will, and a strong hierarchy of value especially. Where is your lightest light in the scene that you're looking at? Is that coming across in your painting, or are there other lights that are competing with it? Well, if they're competing with it, you need to tame them. You need to be able to push them down a little bit in value. Where's your second lightest light? Where's your third lightest light? Similarly, where's your darkest shadow? Where's your second darkest shadow? Do you have those all correctly in your painting? Where's your sharpest edge in the painting? When you look out at nature, what edge jumps out at you first? What edge jumps out at you second and third and so forth and so on? You are in control of the hierarchies, and the hierarchies are the tools you use to weave the visual experience together. Remember, you're not painting objects. You're painting a box of light and air. If I can't recognize the objects, but I can feel like I can breathe in a painting, to me, that is a grand success. Good luck, have fun, and enjoy the process.